This is the 5th generation Ibis Ripley, and of all the fantastic bikes I've had the pleasure to ride this year, this one might just be my favorite. It's one of those bikes that, at least for me and my riding style and terrain, seems to bump your skill and fitness up a notch or maybe 3. It was fast and of course plenty playful on the descents, and had me dropping riders on the climb that I was usually struggling to keep up with. Even still though, this new Ripley is not without a couple quirks and imperfections. So let's take a deep dive into the bike and hopefully help you determine whether or not it could be for you. The latest generation Ripley and Ripmo are a pretty big departure, at least aesthetically, from the bikes they replace. And while I've heard plenty of people complain about what were once a couple bikes that really did look distinct, now joining the ever-growing similar looking straight top tube bikes, I, for one, am a big fan of their clean, simplified silhouette. But this update has done a lot more than just change the look of the bike. There's a lot of cool features that they've added as well. First is the Stow internal storage system, which, in case you're curious, stands for snacks, tools, or whatever. In my case, the whatever was my self-filming setup that I used to make these videos, which easily fit within the 2 included storage bags. Accessing the compartment was super easy, with the faceplate being fully removable via a large lever. Another neat touch is that the aforementioned storage bags are actually made by Cotopaxi using scrap material, and their thicker rubberized surface kept things rattle-free while riding. Another new feature is the flip chip located here on the rear triangle and rocker link that allows you to change the rear wheel from a 29 to a 27.5. Sadly, changing that over isn't quite as easy as on a lot of bikes. You actually have to remove the shock and it gets a little complex, but hey, if you want to have the option to ride this bike as a mullet, you can now do that. Despite usually being a fan of smaller wheels, I actually found that this full 29-inch setup was still plenty playful and maneuverable, and I, as a taller rider, didn't need to go down to that smaller wheel size. But I could see it being a huge perk for people with a shorter inseam who might be hanging up on the rear tire a little more often. The rest of the frame comes with just about every feature you'd expect from a modern mountain bike. You have some nice tube-in-tube cable routing, you get the SRAM universal derailleur hanger, generous dropper post insertion, and of course, the legendary DW Link suspension, which I'll be talking about more later on. Lastly, if you haven't picked up on it by now, the Ripley and Ripmo actually share the exact same frame. They swap the shock and the yoke, but otherwise it's exactly the same, which means, in theory, you could build either bike up to kind of fit the sweet spot between both of those bikes per your riding needs and riding style. I think that makes this bike pretty dang adaptable. One slight drawback to this design though is weight, and this new Ripley is actually 2 pounds heavier than the outgoing model. My extra medium XT build came in at a hair under 31 pounds or 14 kilograms. That's set up tubeless and without pedals. In my opinion, this is still very acceptable, even for a short travel trail bike, but I know there are plenty of people who feel otherwise. Up until recently, the Ripley has been Ibis's shortest travel full suspension bike, meaning it had to cover everything from moderate trail riding to full-on XC racing. But with the introduction of the XC, Ibis's new dedicated cross-country race bike, the Ripley has been free to turn things up a notch or 2. For starters, the bike now has 10 more millimeters of travel in the front and back, putting it at 140 and 130 millimeters respectively. The head tube has also gotten a whole 1.5 degrees slacker, and now sits at 65 degrees. It's also grown substantially in length, with reach measurements growing by as much as 40 millimeters in a given size. For this reason, I, at 6'1" or 185 centimeters, actually went ahead and sized down from a large, which is what I usually ride, to the new extra medium size, which is still actually longer than the outgoing model's large, has a reach of 483 millimeters. The extra medium also has a 629 millimeter stack height, 77 degree seat tube angle, and 437 millimeter chainstays, putting the total wheelbase at 1241 millimeters. Ibis has also gone all in with size-specific geometry on this new bike, with everything from seat tube angle to chainstay length and even bottom bracket height changing when you go from size to size. According to Ibis, their goal in this was to make every size offer nearly identical fit and handling characteristics. Like I mentioned earlier, I did size down from the large to the extra medium. One thing I worried about was that I'd feel too cramped while climbing, but thanks to that size-specific geometry, it wasn't so much the case. The extra medium is actually a half degree slacker seat tube than the large, and then of course with the added saddle height, I felt right at home. And I think it's safe to say that the same would be true if moving in the other direction. The steeper seat tube combined with less exposed post when sizing up should keep things from feeling too stretched out while in the saddle. Next, let's talk components. we reviewed the $6,399 XT build, which sits right about in the middle of the range. Across all of those different builds, it's clear that Ibis has really prioritized suspension performance. As you can see, this bike comes with Fox's full factory setup. You have a 140mm Fox 34 up front with the new Grip X damper and a float factory shock delivering 130mm of travel in the rear. Unsurprisingly, there are no notable performance issues here. I have heard some people say that they would have liked to see a 36 spec'd on the Ripley, but for me personally, I think a 34 is a good fit for the type of riding this bike is designed for and helps keep the weight a little bit more in check. Speaking of the fork, one thing that I was not a particularly large fan of was the loud sucking noise that comes from this new Grip X damper. This is my first time riding this new damper, and I was a little concerned when I couldn't get that sound to go away, thinking there might be an issue internally or with the seals, but after reading several reviews on it, seems like this might just be par for the course for the new bike. Like I mentioned earlier, this didn't affect the performance in any way, it's just the way that the oil happens to move through that damper, but for me personally, if I was buying a $6,500 bike, I don't want to hear that squishy sound coming from the front of it. And I haven't ridden any other bikes with the Grip X damper yet, so I can't speak to how systemic that issue is, but it has been enough that for me personally, if I was on the market for a new bike, I probably would avoid something with that damper simply for that sound. But let's move on to something that I am a big fan of, and that's Shimano's XT group set. Everything on this Ripley, all the way down to the chain, is XT, making shifting performance a dream. The 4-piston XT brakes were also a great fit for the bike, providing more than enough braking power, but I'd likely swap the finned Ice Tech pads to do away with their irksome rattle. Clearly, I don't like my bike making noises. I've always thought that OEM tire choice is a pretty good way to understand what the manufacturer designed the bike for, what type of riding, what type of terrain. And in my opinion, the 2.4-inch Maxxis Minion DHR2 paired with a Recon in the back really speaks to the bike's split personality of efficiency and control. If anything, I would have liked to see an EXO Plus casing in the back, but thankfully never had a puncture while reviewing. These tires were wrapped around a pair of Ibis's Blackbird Send wheels. At 2,100 grams per set, they're far from lightweight XC-inspired hoops, but their 35mm internal width and asymmetrical design keeps them stiff and strong. Another cool feature with these wheels is that Ibis will actually sell you an upgraded driver for just $70 that will double your hub engagement. So if you like high engagement hubs, that could be another selling point for you on this bike. The cockpit also comes from Ibis with the Ibis Hi-Fi bar and 50mm stem. In my opinion, the 50mm stem on a bike that already has a pretty long reach is a little overkill, and I'd happily take a 35mm instead. Another part I'd swap out pretty early on is this bike yoke revolved dropper post, and not because there are any issues with it. Actually, I really liked its light lever feel and fast actuation, but because of its length. The extra medium bike that I tested is only 185mm, with the large and XL frames coming with a 213mm post. Now, it could be said that this is again just another consequence of me sizing down to the extra medium, but with that long straight seat tube, I bet I could fit a 220 on here. So now that you're up to speed on the bike's geometry and components, let's go ahead and talk about on-trail performance, starting with the climbs. The climbing position on the Ripley, at least for me on the sized down frame, was more upright and relaxed than you'd expect for a 130mm bike. Usually I associate that kind of body position with a slower, more lethargic feel, but the Ripley, unsurprisingly, was anything but. I think a big part of this comes down to these fast rolling tires. And like I mentioned at the start of the video, a few times I found myself outpacing buddies of mine that I usually have struggled to keep up with. The other big kicker here is of course the DW Link suspension platform. In case you haven't had a chance to ride one of Dave Weagle's masterpieces before, the hype is definitely real. It strikes a great balance between pedaling efficiency and traction, allowing me to clean sections of trail I'd usually end up hiking. So to wrap things up, despite the extra weight, the new 5th gen Ripley is still absolutely a very competent climber. But it's actually not the thing that made me fall in love with this bike. So now let's go ahead and move on and talk about the descents. Funny enough, my first ride on this bike was actually a shuttle ride on a relatively technical but very fast trail near my house. It took all of about 2 seconds to realize that this bike was about to be a blast, and frankly, it has been on just about every type of terrain ever since. I always say that I feel most confident and therefore fastest and have most fun on a bike that I feel like I can place exactly where I want on the trail at any given moment. And to me, this Ripley really did strike a great balance between being maneuverable and agile in that sense without ever feeling twitchy or unstable when pinned. The frame felt surprisingly stiff for a short travel bike, which I'm sure is an added bonus from being shared with its longer limbed sibling. Obviously, it wouldn't be too hard to find this bike's upper limit on, steep double black terrain or in the bike park, but as far as this bike's intended purpose, those fast, moderately technical or flowy trails, I was really blown away by just how fun this bike is. Speaking of fun, I was also surprised by just how poppy and playful it ended up being as well. I was a little worried that the low bottom bracket and long wheelbase would take away from some of the playfulness that the Ripley is known for, but that is not the case. I think this once again comes back to the DW Link suspension. It was supple at the top, helping maintain grip and therefore speed into features, had a nice firm mid-stroke, which really gave it that poppy, easy to jump feel, and finally ramped up quite a bit coming back down. I actually got myself into some trouble on that very first ride I was talking about when I momentarily forgot I was on such a short travel bike, pulled up off a rise, and landed squarely into a rocky downslope. Needless to say, I bottomed the bike out and the bottom bracket area and crank arm paid the price. Thankfully, this was the only time I had an issue with that relatively low bottom bracket, but due to Ibis's size-specific geometry, the bottom bracket actually gets lower with smaller sized bikes. And again, some of those riders are probably going to be riding a smaller rear wheel, so do with that what you will. My only real quips when descending this bike were pretty superficial, and those most notably were the shorter travel dropper post and that noise coming from the Grip X damper. Otherwise, it's pretty hard to fault this bike for much. And I've said this a lot throughout the video, but the word that keeps coming to mind when I think about this new Ripley is balance. It does a great job retaining the nimble playfulness that the Ripley is known for, while still providing plenty of forgiveness and control on more consequential terrain. That said, don't expect it to be the bike for logging bike park laps or enduro races. For that, you'd definitely be better off with the Ripmo. Now that we've talked about how the bike feels on the trail, let's go ahead and compare this new Ripley to a few other similar bikes. Up first is the Canyon Neuron CF9 SL, which at $5,699 is $700 less than the Ripley XT we reviewed. Seeing as Canyon is a direct-to-consumer brand, it shouldn't be a huge surprise that even at that lower price, you are going to see some higher quality components on the Neuron. The biggest one of these being the carbon fiber DT Swiss wheels that help keep the claimed weight under 29 pounds or 13 kilograms. In terms of geometry, if you compare the extra medium I rode to Canyon's large, the two bikes are pretty similar. Both have 130 millimeters of travel paired with a 140 mm fork, with the Ripley being 1 degree slacker and more or less identical everywhere else. But this is one of those cases where the numbers don't tell the whole story, and on the trail, these bikes actually feel pretty different. The Neuron feels much more like a traditional kind of beefed up XC bike. It hugs the ground and you can tell it prioritizes speed, whereas the Ripley feels like a sporty take on a trail bike. Still fast, but much more eager to pop you off of sketchy side hits. It's also worth noting that the Neuron does not have a flip chip and is only available in 29-inch wheels front and back. So, which is best for you? Well, if you're looking for something that's going to feel a bit more like a traditional cross-country bike, both in terms of weight as well as ride feel, I think that Neuron is going to be the better option. But if you regularly ride more aggressive terrain or simply measure fun and air time versus Strava time, then the Ripley will be the better option. The second bike that I want to compare the Ripley XT to is another 130/140 bike, and that is the Transition Smuggler GX Axis, which lists for $100 more than the Ripley. For that, you get slightly less premium suspension, RockShox Select Plus line, but do get upgraded to the SRAM GXT type drivetrain. Another big difference is tire choice, with the Smuggler sporting an Ascii and DHR2 combo, hinting at its intended use case. So in terms of value, I'd say it's pretty much a wash. And if you want to use weight to differentiate the bikes, then you're not going to have much luck either. Both bikes are within a couple ounces of each other. In terms of geometry, the bikes are, once again, relatively similar, at least if we're comparing the extra medium Ripley to a large Smuggler. Both bikes have an identical head-tube angle and only marginal differences elsewhere. Now, one area that these bikes do differ is in their ability to run a smaller 27.5-inch wheel. Like we talked about earlier, the Ripley does have the flip chip and allows you to do that, whereas the Smuggler is going to be 29-inch front and back all the time. On the trail, though, the Smuggler feels a bit more planted and composed, sacrificing some of the Ripley's light-footedness and climbing efficiency for increased speed and forgiveness on steeper, chunkier terrain. Personally, I can't help but wonder if a lot of this is part spec. That Smuggler, again, coming with the more aggressive tires as well as a slightly stiffer fork than that comes with the Ripley. So, at the end of the day, if you're looking for something that's going to feel a bit more like a mini enduro bike, then I would go with the Smuggler. But if you want something that's going to feel a bit more sporty and agile, then the Ripley is going to be the one for you. The 5th generation Ibis Ripley retains the same nimble playfulness that this bike has become known for, while also injecting a bit more forgiveness and capability by way of increased travel and more aggressive geometry. Like I said at the start of the video, it's one of my favorite bikes that I've had the pleasure to ride this year. And whether you're on the market for a long marathon bike, or you just want a short travel trail bike that's gonna be plenty playful and fun on your lunch rides, then the Ripley could be a fantastic option. Now, one word of advice I have to anyone thinking about buying the Ripley is to make sure to take one out for a test ride, or if nothing else, compare its geometry to your current bike or other bikes you've ridden on 99spokes.com. And that's because it has a pretty long front end and ends up being about a size bigger than most other conventional sizings that you might be used to. Again, I sized down from a large to an extra medium for this review. If you have any more questions about the Ripley, then please go ahead and leave those in the comments and I'll be sure to get you an answer. While you're there, if you haven't done so yet, I appreciate it if you just take a second to like this video and subscribe to the 99 Spokes YouTube channel. And as always, remember that bikes are for everyone. Have fun out there.